Our next guest speaks all over the country about how we can learn from the Beatles as a business. Please welcome the author of the 5 Best Decisions the Beatles Ever Made, Bill Stainton. How are you?
Christopher.
Welcome.
I'm good.
Have a seat.
You look fabulous.
I'm not overdressed, am I?
Not at all. I feel underdressed.
Let's pretend I'm not in an absurd outfit and have a serious conversation.
Okay, this is going to be difficult, but I think I'm up for the challenge.
The Beatles, very marketable, but the Beatles as a business template, where did that idea come from?
Well, I've always loved the Beatles. And when I started speaking about success, I thought maybe I can bring some of that in there. For a long time, I was trying to figure out how do I tie the Beatles in with what we're doing. And then I realized that when it comes to success, they are the gold standard. I mean, you can argue about their music. There are people out there who like their music. There are actually people out there who don't like their music. Some people think it's old-fashioned, some people don't, but you can't argue about the success. So I thought, maybe there's some things that these 4 guys did that can apply to the rest of us. So that's what I spent a number of years looking into.
You talked about, some people think they're old-fashioned. So are the Beatles still relevant today?
Oh, I think they're completely relevant today. I mean, they still sell millions of dollars worth of material every year, and they're constantly in the news. The #1 selling CD in the world in 2001 was a Beatles CD. In 2006, it was a Beatles CD. I think they're completely relevant. And the success messages that they have are completely relevant. They're universal. They apply to anybody.
And I didn't have to look very far to find this outfit. We're about 2 blocks from here. Oh, yes, we've got it for you. Would you like the lime green?
Yeah.
Yes, so there we are. You talk about the Beatles.
It's stunning, really. It is stunning. You might want to consider keeping that look.
I do feel a bit out of place, but you talk about the Beatles setting goals. Really? The Beatles set goals? They weren't just a band?
Yeah, no. They set goals. They back in the early days, whenever the band would get depressed, in the very early days when they couldn't get a recording contract and nobody wanted to hire them, they didn't have any money, their leader, John Lennon, at the time would shout out to the other guys. He'd all of a sudden turn to them and say, "Where are we going?" And they'd all shout out, "To the top, Johnny." And he'd say, "Where's that, fellas?" And they'd say, "To the toppermost of the poppermost." Which, granted, sounds ridiculously corny and silly.
Perhaps.
But the point is they all said the same thing. They all had a single shared vision of where they're going. Their goal was to be bigger than Elvis. The toppermost of the poppermost. May sound corny, but again, when you've got the entire team pointing in the same direction, I mean, that's one of the challenges when I speak on this around the country. One of the challenges I offer to the groups I speak to is, if you were to say that to your team, where are we going? Would they all say the same thing? Do they have that single shared vision? Or are they kind of, well, I'm going over here and he's going over there.
Right.
If you're all pointing in the same direction, that's what it's all about.
Which is a quote I saw in your book that talked about, it's amazing what you can accomplish if nobody's fighting for the credit, right? And that's this sort of thing.
Yeah. It's actually a quote that Harry Truman said. For you kids in the audience, Harry Truman used to be the president of the United States way back. He's like right around the time of Lincoln.
Pre-American Idol?
I think, pre-American Idol, post-Lincoln pre-American Idol, something like that.
Right.
Yeah, he said it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. And that's all about building a great team and sharing the credit. I mean, we've all worked with or for people who are, it's all about me and, you do all the work, but I'm going to take the credit.
Right.
And that's really a short-term approach.
Now, talk about some of the successes that you talk about and some of the failures.
Don't tell me what to do.
Well, okay,
I'm sorry,
if you will.
Sorry.
I mean, look, I put on the costume. I feel like at least you can
true,
share your wisdom.
Yeah, okay.
Talk about some of the successes and failures that you use as examples when they decided to become more than the Beatles and expanded, into a business, really.
Well, it's interesting. There are a lot of companies, small and large companies, that feel like diversification is good, which it is to a point. But you've got to diversify within your area of expertise. The Beatles, whenever they did anything music-related, it was tremendous. I mean, they just could almost do no wrong with that. They had a few songs that were clunkers, but by and large, they were just cool. One time in the 60s, though, they decided to open a clothing store. They knew nothing about running a clothing store. I mean, it was outside of their core business.
Right.
I mean, really outside of that. And it flopped. They actually ended up giving all the clothes away one night. They just said, look, we're just going to give everything away. When they decided to be movie directors and TV directors with it was a project called Magical Mystery Tour, which was a pretty good album, but a terrible TV special. It didn't work. It wasn't what they were best at. See, one of the things that I talk about in the book also is figuring out what is it that you can do better than anyone else.
Right.
For the Beatles, that was music, specifically songwriting and that kind of stuff. When they stuck to that, nobody could touch them. To this day, I mean, it's amazing. They broke up in 1970. To this day, any band that comes along is invariably compared to the Beatles,
right,
and invariably the Beatles come out ahead. That's an amazing legacy, but it's because they stuck to what they did best. When they stretched beyond that, didn't work. I mean, even for the Beatles, it didn't work.
Which a lot of us can take lessons on now. Don't expand too quick. Don't get too, perhaps, cocky in what you're doing and think, I'm successful in this, so maybe I'll put out a record.
Exactly. Know what your strength is.
Okay. You talk about the principles of carrying that weight, in quotes.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, Carrying That Weight, it's a great song on the Abbey Road album, Carry That Weight, but it also means that you can have a great vision and you can build a great team and you can play to your strengths, you can do all these things, but at some point somebody's got to do the work. Carrying that weight is about going the extra mile to get the extra result. It's about rolling up your sleeves and doing the work. Paul McCartney once said, the reason we were twice as good as anyone else is because we worked twice as hard as anyone else. Even the Beatles, they worked and they worked and they worked. They hardly ever took a day off. And if they did have a day off, chances are Lennon and McCartney would spend that day writing songs. They worked their tails off. It wasn't just a fluke or just luck. Yes, they were amazingly talented. Yes, they were gifted. And you can have all that. But unless you're actually in there doing the work, doing what the competition, not just doing what the competition won't do, doing what the competition isn't willing to do.
Right.
That's what gets you ahead.
And a lot of what you talked about is, especially in that show business situation, everybody's fighting for that spotlight. You talk about widening the spotlight and how, in particular, Lennon and McCartney agreed to sort of share things.
Yeah, I mean, very specifically, they had a gentleman's agreement. It wasn't contractual or anything. From very early on, that any song they wrote under the umbrella of the Beatles, whether it was written exclusively by Paul, for example, Yesterday, John Lennon had nothing to do with, but is credited to Lennon McCartney. Or a Lennon song like Strawberry Fields Forever, which Paul had nothing to do with, is credited to Lennon McCartney. It's all about, again, going back to that sharing the credit and having that great team. And that's when you get when you spread the spotlight, everything gets brighter. You get better results and people feel included.
So the book really comes from a speech that you do. You go around, you talk to businesses around the country and even around the world talking about the Beatles as a business model. But a lot of people might say, the Beatles, of course, they're famous. That makes sense, but they broke up. What can we learn from a band that ultimately broke up?
That's true. They were together fewer than 10 years. I mean, that's amazing. Most people don't know that. Fewer than 10 years. And ultimately, they did break up. And earlier on, we were talking about that single shared vision, toppermost of the poppermost, bigger than Elvis, all four people pointing in the same direction. Well, what happened starting around 68 is that started to splinter a little bit. Instead of four people with one vision, you had four people with first two visions, then three, then four people with four visions. And even if you're the Beatles, even if you're at the top of your game, even if you're the best in the world, you can't sustain if everybody is going a different direction. And that's kind of what happened with the Beatles. John wanted to take his music this way. Paul wanted to do this. George wanted to do this. And it was inevitable. A lot of people say, well, Yoko broke up the Beatles or this and that broke up the Beatles.
Right.
That's all symptomatic. What broke up the Beatles was the fact that they no longer had a single shared vision.
So just like a business.
Yeah.
People are going in different directions. Now, I want to talk about, the idea that the Fab Four were really good at being innovative. A lot of business experts, whether it's big business, small business, say that you're not going to be successful by adapting. You've got to be proactive. You've got to be innovative. And you talk a lot about them shaking things up and being innovative.
Yeah, see, here's what happens, Chris. If you keep doing what you've always been doing, even if you're good at it, even if you're the best in the world at it, if you keep doing what you've always been doing, eventually the rest of the world can catch up. And then if you keep doing that, the rest of the world can leave you in the dust. I mean, the world just moves too fast. So you've got to lead the charge. You think about the Beatles. After they got those first 2 or 3 albums under their belt, with every subsequent album, starting with about Rubber Soul or so, maybe even A Hard Day's Night, every subsequent album, you're far too young to remember, but when you got that new Beatles album, you had no idea what to expect. I mean, you get a U2 album or a Stones album.
I don't get that vibe out of the new Hannah Montana album. I think I know what I'm going to get.
Well, maybe you're not listening to it critically enough.
Right.
No, I mean, you kind of know what you're going to get. With the Beatles, you never knew. They were always, I mean, every new album, almost every new song, you listen to it and go like, okay, where did that come from? That's why people like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, when he listened to Sgt. Pepper, he basically broke up the Beach Boys and went into a huge depression. He said, that's, what can we do? Like I say, the competition is still trying to catch up when you're that far ahead of the curve and always looking at what's the next thing. And the Beatles weren't doing that just to beat the competition. They were doing it because that's what their drive was. That's what turned them on. That was, most companies start because somebody or a group of people have a great idea and they're excited and they're passionate about what they do. And then you get kind of into this adolescent stage where it just becomes a job. The Beatles never let it get there until the very, very end, which is another thing why they broke up. But they were passionate about it, so they strove for that excellence, not just to make the Beach Boys mad and all that, but they strove for it because that's what they did. That was their drive.
Wow, very cool.
They never lost a sense of passion.